Hey YouTube, my name is Steph with Artform, and today we've got something a little bit special. Recently I did a video on showing you how I made my diorama from start to finish, and yes, it was a lot of work, and yes, it was many days of dry time, but to a follow-up to that, I just found that just looking back at the video that I just blasted so fast, not really talking through all the supplies and the different things that I've used. So today I'm gonna just tell you what I did for that build. So it's literally like a part 2 of that video if you're the type of person that really wants to know or absorb as much information as you can to do it for yourself. So I thought this would be a bit of an educational video on what I used and maybe give you some tips on how to pursue it yourself. Now my goal was to try and make it as cheap as possible, so using scrap foam, using some cedar bark, some sawdust, and different items that made it I made it as cheap as possible, and some things you can't get around just it being kind of more expensive. So I'll tell you what those are, but if you want to keep it really low cost, maybe don't do as much water or things like that. But nevertheless, I'm going to tell you what I did and the different items that I've used, and you can kind of take it for yourself. If it's way too overwhelming for you, then it's not a big deal, but I thought it was just a learning video anyway. So let's dive right into it. So I have a whole bunch of supplies on this side of the table, and I'm going to be moving them over, explaining what they are, and you'll see how I'll try and get through all of these items. The only item that it was too big to put on the table was the blow-in insulation that I used, almost like a sculpted clay. So I showed you the plaster of Paris on there, and it's just blow-in insulation. Okay, it's like a paper mache for that blow-in insulation. You get these massive bags. Okay, it's like really big, and because it's supposed to fill an entire attic, let's say a commercial attic or whatever. So they are fairly inexpensive. So when I get to that part of the video, I don't have that here just because it was way too big. But let's just dive right into the first item. So I mentioned on there that I used these foam cutters that were like literally $5 on AliExpress or whatever it was, and they come in different sizes and different lengths. Now when I put these together, I actually brought these to my brother's house because they didn't come with a charger. Okay, so these were only a couple bucks each, and the reason for it is they didn't come with a charger, and I didn't realize that, but that's okay. It was fine. That's gonna get what you paid for. So there's a longer one that I bent to be able to do the river, and then there's a smaller one that I used for just more straighter lines. But I brought it to my brother's house, who's a electronics expert, and then we just started pumping voltages through here. And now you're gonna have to do a little bit more research by yourself, but I found that if you grab these like max 3 amp universal chargers, so it goes from 3 volts all the way up to 12 volts, you can kind of play with the temperature, and you just click it to whatever you need. So we found that this guy would draw somewhere around 5 to 6 volts, and when you put 5 to 6 volts, it would draw like, I don't know what it was, like 1.8 amps I believe it was, to get it nice and hot. But if you get it too hot, like if you put it up to, let's say, 7 volts, it would just start cooking through, and it would expand the foam too fast. So we found that this little guy liked 5 to 6 volts, somewhere around there, and this larger guy, which is the big guy, liked more like 9 volts. Yeah, 8 to 9 volts, so it's much longer, so it uses a lot more voltage to create the heat through there, but when it gets nice and piping hot, 9 volts is really cooking. So when you get these, you can actually just insert them as you need. They come with a whole bunch of different heads here, but you just insert them as you need, and all you do is you click them, and these are about like 15 or 20 bucks or whatever, and so you can kind of find them anywhere. But that's what I used. So that's the first section over here. Okay, next up, let's go through the paint. So after I did some painting, right? I painted everything in a deep charcoal kind of gray. I just use this paint over here. Now I can get this in Canada. I don't know if you're from somewhere else, maybe you can't, or you'd have to find something else. but Rust-Oleum paint, and this one is in a charcoal gray satin. Just make sure everything's flat, very flat paint. Okay, next up we have, I'm gonna go through when I talked about I use this, it's sanded grout. There's a whole bunch of different grouts that you can get out there. They're about 10-15 bucks for this giant thing, and I'll never go through this giant bag of grout. But this one I used, the lighter one, I used bone, I guess that's what it's called. I used this one for the paths, but here on this little demonstration here, let's see if I can get it, I have like, you know, bone, and then I have a darker brown and a darker brown, and I don't know what this is. I think it's like some sort of like sugar. Anyway, it's not brown sugar, but something else. But I would actually put real soil, topsoil on here as the kind of the darkest one. And so these are the types of sanded grouts that I used, but you can kind of get these for 10 to 15 bucks, I think, and get as many colors as you wish. You don't need to get that many, and just kind of using them as much as you want. There's a huge, you know, if you're doing multiple dioramas, this is where it starts to pay off, because my next one will be quite cheap. All right, let's keep going. So I'm going to go through these containers here just because they're kind of very similar products and they all do slightly different things. So this is where you can not get too expensive, but in Canada we have a store called Michael's, and they get these ridiculous coupons where you can go to like 30, 40, 50% off one item. So I just go for one item at a time. So because I knew so this Mod Podge mat, I covered the most of the diorama with. That's why I got a big one. This Mod Podge gloss is what I used on top of the resin when I was using my airbrush with no paint in it, just to blow it forward. I found that this stuff just works fan-freaking-tastic. This stuff is so awesome. I actually liked it more than this Liquitex gel. Now this Liquitex gel is what I use to dam up the resin. You can also use it almost like this, where you can actually use it instead of this as well. You can use this Liquitex gel as almost like waves or something like that, because it dries clear, and these all dry clear. But in terms of the water effects, this is where I spent a little bit more. There's only 2 items that I bought from Woodland Scenics, by the way. 2 on this entire diorama. One was the water effects or / waterfall effects. This stuff was just awesome, and they have a really good product, so I didn't really want to mess around with that. I actually just wanted to grab something that I knew was true and would work. And so these 4 items were awesome. I probably have to get some more Mod Podge eventually, just because I use so much of it. Liquitex gel, I almost barely touched the surface, and this I used maybe a little bit of the bottle. There's still a long ways to go. So let's move on. I just really like those, you know, different textures. They all do slightly different things, but play around with the ones that you want the most. The Mod Podge gloss was fantastic though. Next up, oh yeah, so this is from Woodland Scenics as well. I use these for the bushes that I didn't show you how I made. I literally just like hot glued them together, and then I sprayed a whole bunch of Mod Podge matte mixed with water to harden them. Like, they just became hard as stone. And so I just grabbed this like foliage basically, and I just kind of clumped them up together and glued them together, and literally just glued them onto my diorama. Now if you can get endless amounts of vegetation. I just had this from a little while back, so I used it, and I had it. Those are literally the only 2 items that I used from Woodland Scenics. So that's where this over here was, that foliage stuff. This is just regular sand. You can get bags of sand at Home Depot or whatever, and these little colors down here is what I used for my grass. So let's get into that. This is not actually tea. My wife just goes through so much tea that I use these containers once they're empty to hold different things like grass. So I have grass here. I used, as you saw in the video, by the way. So I like this grass, and I have a green grass, I have some yellow grass in there, which is hard to see, and I also made some red grass, and basically like kind of fall, or like almost like wood chips. And I didn't mind the red. I hardly used the red, but the yellow and the green, I had a couple different types of batches, like a really bright green. I also had like a matted, muted green as well that I use, and I just keep them in these David's tea containers because it helps me kind of label the types of colors that are in there. But how I made that, essentially all I grabbed is I work very hands-on on construction, so I do make kitchens as well on the side, and so I had just bags and bags and bags of sawdust, and there's so many great YouTube videos on how to make it. Off the top of my head, I can't remember exactly what the recipes are, so you can kind of check YouTube, you know, how to make grass out of sawdust. And as long as it has some sort of soap, so it keeps everything kind of moving, not just a lot of water. Water kind of dilutes the pigment in the paints, and so make sure that you get a nice, beautiful color in there, and then you lay it out on a tray to let it to dry. But experiment with what you like. This is so cheap that you can literally fail a billion times and still be out in the clear, because it's just find a recipe that works and see how that works for you. But that's how I made all my foliage. Again, guys, this is all really inexpensive ways to do all of these things. We are just motoring through this. So my wife kind of picked up kind of this acrylic set. This is great to have because it's like a 24 set of paints. So it's got this tray, and it has like a whole tray of like greens and purples and all good stuff. So if you know me, you know I hate mixing paints, just because I like for it to be repeatable later on down the road. So I believe I did like, you know, one of the green grasses I used the green, and one of them I used like different types of yellows, maybe. The nice thing about green, you know, I like to make like a brown and a green and a couple different color grass, and I actually like to mix them a little bit, just because your eye it'll look more realistic. So I used some of the black. Now I don't know why this acrylic kind of reacted a little bit, or kind of wiped away some of the black that I had on there. I don't know why that happened, but it's pretty bad. What you didn't see on the video was that on this corner of the diorama where it was the water, if you saw later on in the video, you saw almost like a second layer of resin. And what happened was I had put a second layer of really, really dark, really tinted resin. And when I did that because it was kind of covering the mistakes that happened with this slight reaction. Now, it wasn't a huge reaction. It just, there was like little white marks or something like that. I could just tell that it wasn't perfect. It wasn't how I painted it. So I'd use a tint. That's why I made this kind of bigger wave that went across here, because I was kind of hiding my mistakes. So I was using that. That's just to kind of clarify what I did there. But getting some sort of assortment of acrylic paints is super awesome. You don't have to mix paints, just dive right in and get right down to it. I will leave this on this side. Now, the resin that I used was Envirotex Light. This is where it gets expensive. I don't know of any other way to make this inexpensive. Maybe do less water. I used up almost all of this, but I had a tremendous amount of water. If I would have done a lot more, like, I think these were around $50 for this whole thing, but because I had quite a huge coupon at Michael's, I think it ended up being like $30-some. So that's where it really starts to hurt. But when I did blend these, these together with my pigments, I ended up using I have a whole bunch of like modeling paints. It's for, you know, I use this for painting different characters and such. You can see that on my YouTube channel there. But I used, you know, stuff like cam olive green, which is not a, I try, if as much as possible you want to use the air paint. So like here, let me just see what I had here, which I used. So Imperial Blue Game Air. Okay, I use this as my blue, and it's super thin, but it has a pretty good pigment in there, and it won't clump up the color. All I did was I added like 1 or 2 dots of this green because I really wanted to get the green in there. I also used a I believe it was an ink. So this Game Air I used, and for my brown I used, wait, I'm just having a mind blank here. Game color. I know it's in here somewhere. Brown. It's a Game ink. So I used an ink and I used a Game Air, and this was my brown, this was my blue. I did some of this for the ocean, but when it came to the river, I definitely wanted to lean more on the brown and the green, or like a burnt amber. If you can get something like that, those are great. So the Game Airs work fantastic for tinting, but just do 1 drop at a time and just get it to be a consistency that you want. I found that I actually had to be a little bit darker in the pigment of the water more than I thought, so I had to do that. And then what I also use is I use some Citadel like null oil, which is kind of like a way that you would shade when it comes to shading like a darker color. I actually use this on some of the rocks. It does make it a little bit glossy, but I use this on some of the rock faces near the water, almost like it would splash up. And I actually, just to get into some of those crevices to make it a little bit darker in some spots, I use some null oil. So anyway, there's tons of game paints that I had. Vallejo paints, I had some Citadel paints, but Citadel makes some fantastic kind of shading. They're really good. That company's really awesome, so I recommend getting those. And the last thing I'm going to mention are brushes. Now, brushes comes in all shapes and sizes, and the first thing I'll tell you is that you don't need super expensive brushes. In fact, really cheap brushes. I think these ones were from Diorama. These are the ones I abuse the most. These were from Diorama. They're kind of bigger ones. It's the ones I use for dry brushing. And then these ones over here, which look like this, you can see at Michael's. Again, I just go 1 item at a time, and with those coupons, you can get them for really, really cheap. And they have a lot of great brushes out there. So that pretty much covers everything from start to finish. Cedar bark, cedar bark is, how do you find cedar bark? I saw this on a video, I believe from the Real Terrain Hobby guys, and he's fantastic. He's from a neighboring province of mine, and his stuff you gotta go check out, Real Terrain Hobbies. And he talked about cedar bark, and I thought that it was an absolute beautiful way to sell the effect of rocks. So all these rocks are cedar bark, and you can't sculpt that good. You can never sculpt that well. So using cedar bark, which has kind of horizontal lines, and it has almost like a limestone or like a shale type style rock, and I thought cedar bark was the perfect way to sell the effect. And so just Google what cedar trees look like. It basically looks like pine trees, but they're really red. So there's the core of it will be very, very red, and you can really tell the difference. And then as soon as you walk up to the trees, to healthy trees, you'll be able to see the shapes that I'm talking about when it comes to their bark. So I don't just recommend you start beating on people's trees or on public lands or whatever on those trees. I actually found dead trees, and so I don't have with me the recipe that I used in terms of how to bake it, but I believe I baked it for a couple hours on a very low heat, and all that really does is it just gets all those microbes out, and it just makes sure that this thing's not going to rot over time. So it just kind of bakes all those little microbes out of there, and you can use it. And I went with my daughter for a hike, and we just packed my bag full of cedar bark, and we did 2 full trips, and now I got lots of cedar bark. But I find that the smaller pieces that are pretty small are easier to work with, so don't get these massive pieces, but the smaller pieces that you can get are great pieces to work with, and cedar bark is really what sold this effect more than anything. So I hope this was helpful. If you have any questions, just put them in the comments below. If I wasted your time, I'm sorry. But some people really want to know what I used and kind of the ways that I can get it really inexpensive. But if you really want to really keep it inexpensive, just don't do as much water, and you can really keep the cost down. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. No, I think that's it. Anyway, my name is Steph from Art Forum, and I hope you enjoyed this video, and we'll see you guys next time.